Welcome back, everyone, to this second part on Max Stirner's The Unique and Its Property. And this part is dealing with the section The Free, and then moving through to the later half of the book, Ownness. What we see really in this talk and in these sections is what I mentioned in the first part, that Stirner is undertaking his sort of rather funny, sometimes sarcastic repetition, his philosophical repetition, which these repetitions of the notion of being haunted or possessed by the spirit open the way for a deeper understanding of what one is to do from that conclusion, from that understanding of Geist as infecting us and haunting us, and this notion of extraction, of trying to work ourselves out from elsewhere. What do we actually then do once we realize the potential for egoism and for being an egoist and for taking Stirner basically at his word? Now, we begin with the section The Free, which goes through forms of politics, and then we move through to Ownness, and then near the end we really get this rounded idea of egoism. So we begin with political liberalism, and it should be said that this section is entitled The Free. I think there's a little play there for Stirner on his group, De Freien, I think was the German, The Free, which he would go to the sort of the cafe and just sit there smoking cigars while they all talked. And Stirner's group, the group he was part of, it wasn't his group, but the group that he was part of and is known to be part of, with Bauer, etc., being part of, these were the most modern of moderns. You know, they're sort of the hyper-liberals of the day. And so entitling this section The Free, I think, is a little nudge from Stirner towards his own stomping ground in a way. But it begins with political liberalism, and we begin with this quote: "The bourgeoisie is nothing other than the thought that the state is all in all, the true human being, and that the human value of the individual consists of being a citizen of the state." So Stirner here continues his conversation that he had in terms of talking about the ancients and the moderns, and moves into more modern understandings of politics, but also draws in common notions of how the state is understood. So the bourgeoisie, it's nothing other than, the state is all in all for the bourgeoisie. They are very much in that dialogue of being citizens under a state, and accept that haunting of the Geist, which is the state, and from that understand themselves from it, and then begin their silly search for their true selves, or whatever it might be. Or at most likely, position their understanding of themselves from within the state, as a citizen, as a person of the state, as opposed to an individual. One thing Stirner brings in here is much in the same way that he talks about the death of God, where he says in the previous talk, I mentioned, to paraphrase, that Stirner says, look, there's nothing, the church is just vanity now, it's all gone, it's completely void of content, and it's just basically ridiculous. I mean, his death of God, if we can call it that, is different in the sense that he just says, look, it's just ridiculous, why haven't we moved on from this? There is no content there, that is just completely a Geist, in the sense of just a haunting spirit that is seeking to control, etc. He also brings this in with relation to right in general, against rights, and he mentions as one instance divine right. Okay, so the divine right of kings, the divine right of monarchy would, in his day, monarchism still very much a thing, but as an example, he performs much the same, almost sort of lazy but almost hyper-pragmatic philosophy on this notion of divine right. And to paraphrase, he sort of says, look, with divine right, all rights in general, one can't argue. They can only just state, look, this is complete nonsense. Because there's two pathways that can happen there, and it's the pathways and the dialogue and that friction that I was talking about in the first talk. So if you take this notion of divine right, that the king or the queen or the monarchy is divinely, has the divine right from God to rule. Okay, so Stirner makes this point, look, you can't argue against that. You just state that that's complete nonsense. Because in that argumentation, you enter into the dialogue of state, citizen, teacher, student, whatever the Geist is, that you end up bolstering via arguing against the position. Because by arguing against the position, you enter into that the spirit self-building itself. You're entering into its own process of building. You're entering into a bolstering dialogue with the spirit, the Geist in question. So a complete rejection of divine right, or a complete has to also be a complete rejection of divine right, has to also be a complete rejection of anything such that rights will require for their legitimacy. So it's not like the case that you can argue against this in any other way for Stirner other than a complete rejection, an egoist rejection back to the creative nothing, and just say that's complete nonsense. I won't even enter into a single cog of that machine that you're trying to bolster, or Geist is bolstering from itself, that it's creating from itself. Because in accepting to some extent the existence or reality of divine right, or any rights in general, you are handing over that notion that there is also this other creator, that Geist, that spirit has created this from itself, and you are no longer the creator, you're a subject, you're whatever you might be in relation to that. Stirner says, in relation to political liberalism, Stirner says, whether you're filthy rich or dirt poor, the state of the bourgeoisie leaves that up to you. All you must do is have a good attitude. Okay, so it's an interesting quote, and Stirner actually has a lot of rather nuanced, sarcastic, very sort of volatile attacks on this notion, or general notions of good attitude, or what we might call etiquette. I mean, Louis Ferdinand Céline had this same notion against this, a hatred really of good attitude, and I think it's key to understand where Stirner is coming from this. So he makes it clear that political liberals, don't have the heresy trials that used to exist in religious times. You know, the Industrial Revolution is into full swing. The secularity and atheism is on the up and up in a way. I mean, those heresy trials don't exist anymore, and yet there are those things that one will be sort of quietly, from the position of an extracted human being, declared as a sort of what you might call a Geist heretic against. So one even though we don't have heresy trials in the sense of against God, if one rebels against rational law, or for these days it says, actually, I don't care about the growth of the economy, or I don't care about careers, or whatever it might be, that is a heresy of its own. And so this notion of good attitude, this notion of a sort of etiquette, is almost like it's the attitude of the Geist. So you have this instantiated, implemented creator Geist that builds itself, and then from that comes the attitude which one has in obeyance with that. And so it sort of not necessarily begins because it's all removed at once, but this attack on good attitude, a good attitude towards Geist is very much like a secondary layer of, I've accepted the state, I've accepted, now I'm this sort of lapdog amidst the state. You know, a good attitude is like being a good student. Well, Stirner would say, don't rebel against, there's three layers there, right? A good attitude would be, okay, this is the system, this system is, there is such a thing as a teacher, there is such a thing as a school, there is such a thing as a state, and I should abide with them. And then so to have this comfortable life that I accept all these things exist, I'm a good student. And the next level would be that sort of typical angsty teenage rebellion where the student rebels against the teacher. But as we see with divine right, and rebelling against the king, or whatever it might be, that friction is a bolstering of the very structure of that Geist altogether. And so what really needs to happen is you go right to the non-root, because it's really creating itself, and say, actually, this whole Geist of state, school, whatever it might be, is just complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. I remove myself. I am a creative nothing. I mean, and then begin the egoist begin to act, be the individual from that position. Stirner goes on to say, political freedom means this, that the polis, the state, is free. religion freedom this, that religion is free, just as freedom of conscience indicates that conscience is free. Thus it does not that I am free from state, from religion, from conscience, or that I am rid of them. It does not mean my freedom, but the freedom of a power that rules and vanquishes me. This is where the notion of freedom actually gets very nuanced, and I'll draw something in that is right at the end of this talk, which is the notion, one of the more common notions of freedom that we hear today is freedom of speech. And with these other notions as well that Stirner mentions here, freedom from political freedom, religious freedom, freedom of conscience, okay? So political freedom, the freedom to, I guess, to express oneself politically how they see fit. Religious freedom, to worship how one sees fit, and then whatever it might be from these, conscious freedom, the freedom to exist morally how one sees fit. Now, the problem with this freedom, as Stirner says, is it does not mean my freedom, but the freedom of a power that rules and vanquishes me. Now, what he means by that is that you can't ask for freedom. In the act of saying, we want freedom of speech, we want freedom of religion, we want freedom, we want this freedom. Once again, you're entering into some dialogue of having to ask it, which presumes a certain geist which has some form of authority over freedom. So you can't ever ask for freedom, and you also can't have part of freedom. There's either freedom, or you are a slave in some sense to geist of a certain kind. Okay, so freedom is entire or not at all. One cannot have a part. Okay, free people end up forced into thousands and thousands of things, says Stirner. Okay, we say we live in a free country, but ultimately when we look around, I'm in the UK, but you might be in America or whatever, people say, well, it's a free country, but when you look around, you see basically the same forms of geist that are infecting everyone. Oh, it's a free country, but there's the state, there's the school, there's the economy, there's etc., etc., etc. There's all these spirits, all these geists that are haunting people at all times to guide them and possess them in their actions. Okay, the individual doesn't become free then, right? Within this form of freedom, the individual doesn't become free. The citizen becomes free. So you're a citizen who's haunted by the notion that the state, that authority of the geist of the state is presumed and true. The X or the Y becomes free, but it's never the individual. It's never this full individual freedom. Okay, and in this sense, we enter into that hierarchy that I mentioned in the first part. So from this, say, well, we have a freedom of whatever I'm a citizen who's free within the state. But by abiding by that, the moral and therefore the immoral are projected as the values of the spirit that you are possessed by, but implied by the hierarchy of the spirit. So if the spirit in question is, let's say, an easier one, if the spirit in question is the church, then the morality that is haunting is that of the dogma of Scripture. If the spirit is that of the state, then the morality that is haunting them is that of law. And from that morality comes the hierarchy wherein there is now such thing as an immorality. There is now such thing as a criminal. There is now such a thing as a justified prison, etc. Stirner goes on to say here, the workers have the most enormous power in their hands, and if one day they became truly aware of it and used it, then nothing could resist them. They would only have to stop work and look upon the products of work as their own and enjoy them. This is the meaning of the labour unrest that is looming here and there. The state is founded on the slavery of labour. If labour becomes free, the state is lost. Now, the reason I emphasise this section is because there's a fair amount of scholarship around Stirner possibly being a communist. Now, I will outright say I believe this to be completely false. To say something along these lines I think is ridiculous, and I think actually Stirner goes to great lengths to make it clear that he isn't, because one of the specific targets he takes to use as an example against this notion of Geist hierarchy is the notion of the worker. And so the state is founded on the slavery of labour. If labour becomes free, the state is lost. Now, I ultimately don't think that quote is anywhere in keeping with communism. But, you know, one thing that Stirner emphasizes is that the idol, the spirit of, if we go through the idols and spirits, right, the idols of the spirit, that is the church, are saints and God, okay, and dogma, as its laws. The idols and the idols of the spirit, that is the state, are politicians, are policemen, are prime ministers, or whatever they might be. The idols of the spirit, that is communism, are the worker. You are still a worker, right? And if you say you're no longer an individual, you are a worker. And Stirner, being very funny as he usually is, what's the hierarchy that is implied by the worker, in the sense that if you have the moral, you have the immoral. If you have the worker, you have for Stirner what is translated by Landstreicher as the lazy bones, right? If you have the worker, you have the person who doesn't want to work. You have the lazy bones, okay? So Stirner says that the lazy bones is a man not yet converted to the faith of work. And so there is this general, in the terms of Geist as spirit, there is a general understanding of a religiosity. We are all religious still, but it's the belief and the faith in whatever idols of whatever spirit, in the sense of Geist, okay? So moving through to social and humane liberalism, the two next sections, I'll just move that there. So this is like Stirner's, I have to say this in this day and age, this is Stirner's Žižekian Joker moment, right? We live in a society, right? Well, actually for Stirner, we don't live in a society, because society isn't even a thing. He says, what is society? Where is it? Okay, well, show it to me. Show me this Geist that is society. So actually, we don't live in a society, because society is simply a spook, right? Instead of saying we are bodies, we're not this all. Okay, we're individuals. Okay. Now, he goes on to say, "Let no one have anything anymore. Let everyone be a pauper. Let property be impersonal. Let it belong to society." So after communism, so if you think about the trajectory of this book, there is, if you're reading quite lazily, you might think, oh, my thing might be saved, right? My thing, my comfort, my Geist comfort might be saved. It begins with the ancients, and then they move from the world into skepticism and reason in general, and we move through to Christianity and to God as the Geist. Then we move through to the bourgeoisie. Okay, that sort of those sort of material comforts. Then we move through to communism and the worker as the idol. And now Stirner's going, well, actually, what about society as the Geist that we are all infected by? Everything is impersonal. It all belongs to society. There's still taxation. There's still the notion of, once again, a good attitude of someone within society. No one's Diogenes. No one's Stirner. Okay, and there are no egoists. It's not. We abide by something that we cannot put a name to, and in that, all the individuals are flattened, and everyone becomes equal and is no longer the individual. Before the supreme ruler, the sole commander, we had all become equal persons, i.e. zeros. For Stirner, if everyone is equal, everyone is nothing, because there aren't individuals. The supreme ruler could be an idol of the Geist, so it could be the king, could be the priest, or whatever it is, but then the ruler itself could be this notion of society, this complete haunt, okay? Progressive equality, a general prosperity, communist equality, where we are all workers, okay? We are all workers, we are all citizens, we are all sinners. There is always this religiosity of the herd, of the sheep and the shepherd, okay? Apparently, society will give us what we need, and yet this thing that will give us what we need, whether it be the state, the church, society, we can never find it, because it's the elusive, irreal creator that creates itself from nothing in that zone of extractions. So in fact, we don't live in a society, okay? That's pretty much my comments on social liberalism, which is a bit of a shorter one. Then we move through to humane liberalism, and this is where we begin to talk about really a greater emphasis on that notion of good attitude. Okay, so Stirner makes it clear. He says the bourgeoisie are outraged at vagabonds, at the unemployed. So the bourgeoisie are outraged at vagabonds. Okay, that's their hierarchy. If you're a bourgeoisie and you're building yourself up in that sense, those that are living as a vagabond, that's moral, immoral. The worker, moral, is disgusted at the idler, the lazy bones, immoral. So where is all this coming from? It's coming from the humane consciousness. Okay, so the point of the humane consciousness is to make that former moral, that Geist that has founded that morality from its own, once again, elusive nothingness creation. It's making that judgery of the morality universal by way of making it the moral standard. You know, if you're under the communist state, you should be a worker, and therefore being a lazybones is the immoral standard. And in doing so, leisure becomes an equal measure too. Okay, that's in relation to, it's an arbitrary choice after the fact of one's moral good attitude. Leisure is sort of earned in relation to. Okay, leisure is this strange thing that, you know, you can't just have that. You can't just lay around and do that. Leisure becomes this strange thing that is, you know, after all said is done, then maybe, you know, I've earned to be an individual or whatever it is. Completely ridiculous. You only work, says Stirner, because after a day's work is done, revelry, loafing about, is good. And how you while away your leisure time is left to chance, he emphasises. And it's interesting that he's so sarcastic with that quote, because, you know, you'd think that someone like Stirner would be all for, from an egoist perspective, leisure time, revelry. But he makes it clear, actually, that from the egoist egoist perspective, that it isn't anti-work in the sense you just lay around and do nothing. It's because one has been haunted and infected and possessed by Geist, or whatever Geist it may be, then the leisure is coming at the expense of that as something that is only understood in relation to that prior haunting. And so it's left to chance. Loafing about is an unserious. You're no longer interested in life because it's after the fact of that possession. And Stirner says the egoist is always interested, and so he doesn't like that disinterest that comes after the fact of the haunting. Okay, if the doors to egoism are still locked, then this leisure is simply disinterest in life. If you're not going to make that full leap, that full step back, then leisure is just, I just don't care about life. I'm part and parcel of this. Oh, I can't wait for the weekend, right? That I can't wait for the weekend. I can't wait for my holiday. That is all part and parcel of the very same dialogue that bolsters the Geist of the modern day economy, GDP driven 9 to 5, right? So the politicians seek then from that to erase personal will. Okay. But our sense of, they seek to erase personal will so that you become, the politicians being the idol and the priests of the state, the Geist of the state. But our sense of self, okay, this is like there's a progression that Stirner has that's very interesting. Politicians will seek to erase personal will into that equalization where we're all zeros, but we still have a sense of self in property, right? The socialists then seek to erase property, but we still exist and such continue to have an ownness. After all things, after all that could be one's own, the will, the property, whatever it might be, there is still an ownness of our possible individuality. As all becomes powerless, so must ownness or egoism in general. Okay, so egoism becomes fought on principle, for everything vanishes in the face of the individual, right? And I think the best way to think about this idea of what happens after this removal of individual things is the reality actually of the book itself, the unique in its property. Because one of the anecdotal things is it was banned for prisoners. Okay, it had a fairly controversial landing and start on whatever, but within certain places it was banned for prisoners to read. And I think, it's probably to an extent how many prisoners were probably going to ask for it anyway. But what does it really show us about the book is that within the confines of the prison, within the confines of the cell, this book, as understood and from an egoist, actually the thing they sought to take from you in prison or wherever it might be, cannot be taken because of this egoist understanding. And it's banned for those reasons. So there is something that always remains fought on principle, okay? Stirner says, so at this end of the modern age, the age of the moderns, there returns as the main point what had been the main point at its beginning, intellectual freedom, okay? How can you truly live socially so long as even just one exclusivity still exists between you? I ask the opposite. How can you be truly unique so long as one connection still exists between you. If you are connected, then you can't leave each other. If a tie encompasses you, then you are only something with another. And 12 of you make a dozen, thousands of you are people, millions of you, humanity. Only when you are unique can you have intercourse with each other as what you are, okay? So, once again, this is entering into that notion of ties, connections. I'd say it sort of as a dialogue. State, citizen, teacher, student, okay? Any connection like this exists. You are giving your individuality, you're giving your egoist potential over to a dialogue, which in that dialogue is having a foundation of Geist, okay? The dialogue of student-teacher is reliant on the Geist that encompasses them all together. To remove oneself from that friction, you cancel the whole thing out, okay? So you cannot be free until, if any connection still exists. Both criticism and masses are enemies of egoists, and both seek to free themselves from egoism, as much by purifying or cleansing themselves as by attributing it to the opposing party. Criticism, opposition. Masses, opposition. Anything where there is an oppositional standpoint, once again, that there is a Geist which is haunting the whole dialogue and making it a thing altogether. And it's that the egoist is removing themselves from. Free yourself as far as you can, and you've done your part. Because it is not given to everyone to break through all limits. Or more eloquently, that is not a limit for everyone which is one to the others. Consequently, don't exhaust yourself on the limits of others. It's enough if you tear down your own. And I think that quotation in itself is enough for any arguments of how could everyone be an egoist. Surely society wouldn't function. It's not going to happen. It can't happen. And that there is, if you want to say, what would Stirner exactly pinpoint to say for individuals to do? Free yourself as far as you can, and you have done your part. Okay, not everyone can break through all limits, but just to get people to see some of the limitations, I think that might even be enough as well. So we move here through to Ownness. So this is the sort of the final section. There's a very, very short section on the unique right at the end, but Ownness, Eigenheit, translated also as property, peculiarity, or individuality. Basically, ownness is that which distinguishes and is individual. Okay, are people supposed to give you this freedom? Are they supposed to permit it to you? Ownness cannot be permitted, as we have spoken about. You cannot be given freedom. You cannot be given your ownness. You cannot be given your property or individuality. Okay, you should not then just be rid of or free of that which you don't want, but also be an owner of the egoist outward into the world. What is there that cannot be shaken off? And then there's also the ownership and the onus of the individuality that comes from that. So there is almost like a constant exorcism in a way, and I think exorcism might be the potent word. You might be able to argue that there is just this point once the realization is at hand that everything just falls away. But one thing I think to really drill down into the etymology and the playfulness of the language of spooks, spirits, Geist, possession, and haunting, all these terms that Stirner uses. If we think of a haunting, you know, to be haunted, if a house is haunted, it's sort of hidden in the walls and occasionally creeps out and things like this. So if an individual is haunted, you need a real exorcism, a sort of potent realization to oust, you know, the Geist of the state or whatever it might be. And this is where ownness comes in, this individuality, this property, Eigenheit. Ownness is my whole essence and existence. It is myself. I am free from what I am rid of, owner of what I have in my power or what I control. I am at all times and under every circumstance my own, if I know how to have myself and do not waste myself on others. No longer giving over what one has in their power, which I will get to, what one controls from their essence, and that which one is free from in that sort of, my own language there, act of exorcism, or exorcist realization, if you will, okay? And all the freedoms thus far that in relation to in part one, as well as earlier in this talk, in relation to, as I've said, religious, political, and whatever they might be, those forms of humane freedoms, these are all specific freedoms. So specific freedom brings with it a new rule because it's still in that connection. It's still in that dialogue. When you invent the car, you invent the car crash, says Virilio. And so when you invent the specific freedom for yourself, I am free from the state. Some people will end up sort of like, I am free from the state, so now I'm an anarchist, right? I am, you know, whatever it might be. A lot of people just end up becoming the opposite, you know, and that's still a connection. I think it's one of the great errors of reading Stirner is that people see many people say like, oh, I've become an egoist, so now I just shoplift, or now I do whatever this might be, because it's seen as like against, but the against is a connection, the against is a tie. You're still tying yourself to the geist that you sought to rid yourself from. How can the right voice sound forth from you? All is for one's own sake. Whether we see this or not, it's why not choose the whole eye the way through. So when we think about specifics, when we think about parts, when we think about antagonism and dialogues once again, and how do I direct myself against that thing, it's always a case of wholeness, of choosing the complete individual, one's ownness the whole way through, never giving over to Geist. Freedom only teaches. Get yourselves relieve yourselves of everything burdensome. It does not teach you who you yourselves are. Rid, but ownness calls you back to yourselves. It says, come to yourself. And so in that process of getting rid, of exercising, there's something there that's still always the ownness. And so even though Stirner would say on a practical level to get rid, to exercise these geists, there is still something there that is the ownness that you can come back to. And this is where he begins, or will relate to the first talk of Stirner's very against the idea of a real self, which I spoke about in the first talk. I don't like it either. The modern idea of, I will find myself on holiday. If I go traveling, I will find myself. If I go to the back of the supermarket, I'll find my real self. You know, if I read enough Jung, if I read enough mystical texts, I will find my real self. And this notion of ownness is a recognition of yourself first, that you already are your complete self, your complete I. So these specific freedoms are a non-thing. So the process of ridding is not, it's not seeking freedom, it's an idealism, because you're still tethered and you're still believing in something that is other than yourself. If I just get rid of this, then I'll maybe find myself. If I can just work out why this thing is connected or whatever, what this guy is doing to me, then I'll find myself. But Stirner says, no, you already are yourself. There is no real self. Be yourself, the almighty I, as in I am. Okay? Tormenting oneself is what it means to rid. It is avoidance. Okay? It's that binary spookdom. It's the binary geisterdom. The tormenting, antagonistic relationship with oneself that you might call a sort of idealist asceticism. If only I can push this thing away enough. If only I can antagonize this, if only I can push the state away or antagonize the teacher, then I will find myself. But those binaries are what keeps one from recognizing they already are the almighty I. They already are their complete selves. Okay. But there's a pragmatism. There is a pragmatism here and a practical way of attending to this. I get around a rock that stands in my way until I have enough power to blow it up. I get around the laws of a people until I've gathered the strength to overthrow them. Now, for most people, those things are never going to happen. So there's a notion of I get around a rock that stands in my way. All right? What individuals, failed individuals, are doing when they're, having that antagonistic relationship is just running into the rock, saying one day, that's sort of allowing Geist its false sovereignty. Whereas Stirner has this practicality of the egoist just walks around it, okay, but it's still not within the power, which we'll get to. Okay, my freedom becomes complete only when it is my power. But by this, I cease to be merely a free person and become an own person. Okay. A free man drags a chain of that which he is free from. Okay, still that connection. A free man drags a chain of that which he is free from. And the ownness, someone who is their own person, has had that realization with respect to that dialogue of Geist, whereby the thing that he was free from, it's just not a thing anymore, all right? Ownness, then, is a description of the owner, and the owner has power. So that brings us through to the owner. The owner, okay? Do we see in others human beings? Do we see people? Do we see individuals? Or do we see a concept, okay? Do we see children of God? Do we see, quite literally, children of God by the church, sinners, children of Geist, children of the Spirit, children of a child of the spook? This is a citizen. This is a student. This is a whatever, a worker, right? Whatever this might be. But these, for Stirner, do we see them as embodied individuals, embodied eyes? We don't see that. We see phantasms. We see someone who's got that car, that job, that career, lives in that house, and is an amalgamation in much the same way that Geist amalgamates itself, and an aggrandizement of different Geists, which build something that isn't just extracted and not embodied. Okay, the spirit of humanity even dwells in you. You are a human being. The spirit of Christ dwells in you. You are a Christian. The spirit of retail work dwells in you. You are a retailer. The spirit of communism dwells in you. You are a communist. But you are never an individual. Okay? No one is ever themselves. They are haunted. They are possessed by the state, by whatever spook it might be. So all of this is an indwelling that for Stirner needs to be exercised by the owner to have the recognition that they are their own and they don't even need the connections. The spirit is thus treated not as a property, but as the eye itself. These aren't things that you can interact with and say, like, maybe use as tools, but it's that indwelling that, dwells in you, that you actually conflate it with your actual self. Liberalism is a religion because it separates my essence from me and sets it above me, since it exalts humanity to the same extent that some other religion would its god or idol. So it's a process of extraction. It dwells in you, and in dwelling in you, it takes the you and throws you into that realm of the spirit, so you're no longer an embodied, self-owned individual. Okay? In short then, all of this is religious. All of these Geists are religious, not just Christianity, not just religion as we usually understand it, but all of these. Okay? So we begin with common religion, Christianity, for Stirner, Christianity. Once that Geist is accepted, you have that morality that comes from the hierarchy that is put into play. Sinners and virtues, saints and sinners, okay? Moral, immoral. When the state, we have a citizen, we have a criminal, moral, immoral. The communism, worker, lazybones, okay? Moral, immoral. And all of these have their respective good attitudes. All of these have their respective sort of parishioners and hymns and sermons and gods and idols. And that ultimately everything is religious. And Stirner says, religion is that which separates us from ourselves. So all of these have the exact same function in the sense that this form of religious, Geist-based thinking comes in and dwells within us. The Spirit of Christ is within you, the Geist of the state is within you, etc., etc. It dwells in us, but indwelling in us, it extracts us into that realm of the Spirit, and we're no longer individuals. Okay? The state thus defines the human, and if one is not a human, one is an inhuman monster and is locked up in an asylum. The state defines the criminal, and if one, or the law-abiding citizen, and if one is not a law-abiding citizen, they get locked up in a prison. The church defines, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So a human being who doesn't correspond to the concept of human being, as the inhuman is something human that doesn't fit the concept of the human. So the definitions that are brought about by the state with respect to sinners, workers, etc., etc., this form of hierarchy-based morality is what defines what people will accept, what will happen to their own individuality. Okay, but Stirner does accept that Christianity has fallen away. He basically says at the end of the life in one of his last letters that this is just complete nonsense. And so we're now all humans of the state, and thus we require that morality to keep us not as individuals. Okay, Morality is not compatible with egoism because it doesn't accept me, but only the humanity in me. Now, this is a tough thing to think about when we get through to really the discussion of morality in Stirner, because I would argue, along with someone like Zizek, I would think, and many others, that basically the morality that we have in the Western world at the moment, the modern Western world, is still emphatically Christian. Nietzsche would say this as well, what he called the sort of cult of niceness. The basis for our morality is still largely the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount, if you were to drill into them, and maybe the Golden Rule from Kant, do unto others as you wish to be done to you. So we're not really thinking about morality in that sense for Stirner. Okay, we're not thinking about good or bad, because good or bad would be the very geists that Stirner wishes egoists to go away from. So when he says morality is not compatible with egoism, what he's really on about is back to those connections, back to the tethers, okay? So whatever of those geists that you abide by, there is a morality that is instantiated by one's acceptance and haunting and possession by the geist. For instance, if you are possessed by the geist of communism, then the morality that comes about from that is that it's moral to be a worker for the state, and it's immoral to be a lazybones because you're lazy, right? So when he says morality is not compatible with egoism, it's that form of dialogue and connection. Because if you'd say, oh, what he really means is, you can go kill someone, it's not that at all, because morality, if you were to say that morality is in relation to traditional notions of good and bad, that's a whole world of geists that you've already accepted. So it's morality on a far more meta level, okay? But morality is not compatible with egoism because it doesn't accept me, but only the humanity in me. Or to extend that, only the communism in me, only the state in me, only the whatever it might be in me, right? So the state demands I become that which I am not. One becomes disgusted at themselves for not being able to truly be the ideal that is told that is their phantasm. As we saw in part 1, this indwelling from the Geist, whatever the Geist might be, then all of a sudden you are not yourself, you're not your embodied self, because as the notion of the state indwells in you, you conflate it with your I, or if, let's stick with communism, if communism indwells in you as a Geist, you conflate yourself with a worker for the state, and in doing so, you are extracted and you're in the realm of spirits. But once you're in the realm of spirits, you, as we saw in part 1, you are always trying to become the perfect spirit, but you can't become the perfect spirit because the development of the spirit is infinite, okay? The empire of the spirit is infinite, okay? And so you're never yourself once you abide by this, okay? The human being is the last evil spirit or phantasm, the most deceptive and the most intimate, the craftiest liar with the honest face, the father of lies. From this, we move through to power. My power is my property. My power gives me property. My power am I myself, and through it I am my property. So we've gone through ownness, and then the owner is he or she which takes up this ownness and is attempting to have that understanding of, or move away from the connections from the morality as I've explained it. And then to do this, one needs power. So my power. Right is the spirit of society. We've spoken about rights. But if we think about power, right, justice is domination over individuals. That's society. Rights are given. That's a power because it's something that the spook or spirit that we consider to be society actually has that power to say, okay, if we accept this Geist, if we accept the spirit that is the state, well, then from that, laws, regulations, bureaucracy, red tape, that is all power because it can retain and hold itself. Taxation is power. Okay. Oh, if we talk about property in the very material sense of one's property of a home. Oh, I own my home. Well, actually, there's still a massive amount of governmental and state-based, Geist-based power there, which is taxing you, which is theft. I had to get taxation as theft in on a Stirner talk, of course. So who gives us the right? Okay. What is power? Well, power is found in the dialogue of, hang on, there is laws, therefore something is given, the freedom is given. So who gives us the right? The state, the church, whatever it might be. The Geist, so the spirit gives us the right to do whatever we want. And in that decision is power. Is something that can be held, is something that can be retained. Okay. It's all religious. Okay, rights come from one's God. I would change that to rights come from one's Geist. Rights come from the state. Rights come from the teacher. Rights come from the school. Rights come from celebrities, newspapers, idols. They come from one's gods. Okay, the right to say this or that. You are supposedly giving it to yourself, but you're giving it to your self from this sort of veiled religious worship of Geists and idols. Okay. But there is power before a right. Because something is given, there is that authority of can have the right or can't have the right, okay? Egoistic right. It is right for me, therefore it is right. That is egoistic right. For the state, it is absolutely necessary that no one have a will of his own, once again, because if you had a will of your own, then all of a sudden what is given from one's ownness and not from the state, right? So, in this, what happens from this in terms of power and in terms of rights is that every I is a criminal, for the criminal is that which is only born from the state. As such, each I is a criminal from birth. This is actually very close to Foucault much later on, in the sense that once you, and I will change this a little bit, but Foucault makes the point in, I can't remember which book now, that once you have homo criminalis, this notion that a human being can be a criminal, there's no longer this blank, there's no longer like ultimately the ownness, there's always the decision. Either you are a law-abiding citizen, which means you have the potential to become a criminal, or you are a criminal because you have disobeyed the morality and you are immoral in the eyes of the state. Now, if we look at this from a Stirnerian or an egoist point of view, actually what's happening there is a complete abeyance in terms of the Geist, which is the state, which allows this. So once again, those dialogues are implicated by the fact of possession by it. So if you're possessed by the notion of the state, then bang, you're into the dialogue that is, there are such a thing as laws, there is such a thing as whatever it might be of a criminal, of etc., etc., okay? So from this, each Geist assumes the worst already of all those who are possessed by it. We see this with the church, that everyone is a sinner, okay? In the state, everyone is a criminal. Everyone is a criminal until they prove they're not, right? Everyone is avoiding tax until they submit the form or whatever it might be, okay? And the criminal in this sense, the criminal, the sinner, the immoral person, the lazybones, hates themselves for broaching the laws of the Geist, okay? So you're never perfect in the eyes of the Spirit, because those potentialities are what aggrandizes the Geist itself. The egoist is only shameful that he never went even further with his will. The egoist has stepped back from all of those dialogues and is beginning the process of understanding his power, his or her power. I demand no right, so I also don't need to recognize any. What I'm able to get by force, I get by force, and I have no right to what I don't get by force, and I don't boast or console myself with my inalienable rights. We see this with the rock in the road, where Stirner says, well, until I have the powder to blow it up, I will just walk around it. The power is this very sort of complex, nuanced thing, okay? And it's what someone can hold, and it has, this is probably the most abused part of Stirner, if you look at, and I'm thanking Wayne Bradshaw for mentioning these to me, but Arthur Desmond or Ragnar Redbeard with Might is Right, sort of an abuse of Stirner, and also Gabriel D'Annunzio with his entry into Fume, is also this sort of, you could almost say like a hyper-egoist thing of how to understand power in this sense. So we move through from power into my intercourse, right near the end of the book here. So society, which I've spoken about, is once again, it's sort of a reiteration of certain Geists, but society then becomes a prison, state ultimately becomes a prison that is defined then as a place to contain prisoners. And this is once again the hierarchical notion of Geist-based morality. So state is a citizen prison to contain citizens. The church is a sinner prison to contain prisoners. Of course, this can't contain egoism. But the notion of a prison and the metaphor of a prison is utilized by Stirner. Once again, his book was banned to be read in prisons. is utilized by Stirner, because what happens in prisons when you really can't, when you actually are so fully into that antagonistic relationship that you clearly are going to upset the apple cart of the Geist. Solitary confinement, you are taken away because this person, it's almost like the cave, right? The notion of Plato's cave. You're out of the cave, you realize the truth, and then you come back in and try to tell everyone. Well, Plato would say they'd beat you up, but I think the cave itself or the prison itself would say, no, we need to get you away because we want to keep this Geist alive, okay? Because in being removed, what you're actually trying to do is change the conversation which is being defined by the Geist itself. The state defines its conversation. The state aggrandizes itself in that spirit world, whereas if someone's so antagonistic, they're upsetting that conversation. But the problem there is in that dialogue, the notion of solitary confinement bolsters the notion of prison altogether, right? Oh, they were so bad, and of course we have to be good in the prison, that we had to take them into an even worse form of solitary prison, right? So these conversational definitions, or these defined conversations that are defined by the Geists themselves, are that which limits man's egoistic freedom. Family, society, state, etc. There are just thousands, millions of them that continually limit man, and just he tries to think he's free, but really he's got thousands of chains on him. I'm a free thinker is usually just an antagonistic relationship with very common conversations, okay? And all this is a sacrifice of one's ownness to a presupposed sacredness in that antagonistic relationship, okay? So pretty much all interactions are mediated via a certain Geist. Everything becomes mediated as to not be one's own work, not be one's own thoughts. Schoolwork is mediated by the school, by the teachers, by assistants. Work is mediated by the bosses, by the owners. State is mediated by thousands and thousands of bureaucrats, etc. Okay. Stirner goes on to say, here is the feature of all reactionary desires, that they want to set up something universal, abstract, an empty, lifeless concept, whereas the self-owned strive to unburden the sturdy, lively particular from the tangled mass of generalities. And it's in what Stirner considers the feature of all reactionary desires, universal, abstract, empty and lifeless, which is really a description of the empire of the spirit, okay? It's universal because spirit is absolutely everywhere and can describe everything in that removed, extracted zone. It's abstract because it doesn't actually have a basis that you can ever find. It's empty because it doesn't actually have any content. And it's lifeless because it doesn't have any content once again. But it grandizes itself. It's an infinite, universal, abstract, empty, lifeless empire. Anyone in whose head or heart or both the state sits, anyone possessed by the state or the believer in the state is a politician or remains so forever. You can change that quote however you want. Anyone possessed by communism or a believer in communism is a worker and remains so forever. Anyone possessed by the school and a believer in the school is a teacher and remains so forever. On and on and on. It's just a reiteration of what it is to be possessed. Property is the expression for unlimited control over something, thing, animal, human, of which I can dispose of as I see fit. Once again, this is the notion of power and understanding of one's relationship with property and power. These are directly linked for Stirner. Freedom belongs to the one who takes it. So we think about taxation, state and property. What is taxation? It's probably one of the greatest examples of what it actually is to have power in a very, very manipulative way over someone. Oh, you own your property and you're free, but actually you're always going to get taxed by us for no real reason. What then is my property? If we think about taxation in this, I think it's one of the better examples. What then is my property? Nothing but what is in my power. Is your property in the material sense in your power? Well, not if you have to keep paying the state, which is a complete Geist, taxation on it. Egoism has no intention of sacrificing anything or giving up anything. It simply decides what I need, I must have, and will get for myself. Read into that all you want. I don't need to explain that one. There's nearer the end, Stirner does take up, I guess, incoming laissez-faire notions. So what of competition? Well, it's within the bounds of the state. This is the problem that he sees. And such we are mere persons beneath the state, chasing its belongings that can never become entirely ours. Taxation, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Once again, this is all asking for freedom. But the point with competition and I guess laissez-faire markets is that if the geist of the state is ultimately that which is haunting and possessing everything, then the competition is still within the bounds of a certain dialogue happening underneath within the empire of the state. Over the gateway of our time stands not the Apollonian slogan, know thyself, but actualize yourself. And the difference here is kind of key, but know thyself is, I need to go into the area of mind, and I have to believe in this idea that I'm going to find my real self by doing certain epistemological tricks and figuring out all these different empires of Geist. Actualize yourself is to begin from the position. You are yourself, right? It's not even an understanding. It's not a process of mind. To actualize yourself, you begin from yourself, from the individual that is not connected to any of these tethers, not to any of these dialogues of Geist morality. And we finish here with my self-enjoyment, quite aptly. One uses life and consequently himself, the living one, by consuming it and himself. Enjoyment of life is using life up. One who is worried about living is not living or enjoying their life. One needs to use life. What is it to worry about life? What is it to worry about life? To worry about life is to give oneself over to a Geist. Sure, you could argue night and day that all these worries are legitimate, but in your supposed legitimacy, you are giving authority and you're giving over your power to the Geist in question. To worry is not to live. Okay? Worrying is not living, it's not enjoying life. Enjoyment of life is using life up, is to having that ownness, having that power to declare what is for one's egoist self. Stirner says on page 333, I can never be happy with myself as long as I think that I first still have to find my true self, and that it must come to this. That not I, but Christ, or some other spiritual, i.e. ghostly I, for example, the true human being, the human essence or the like, lives in me. So there's nothing like that for Stirner. There is no indwelling, there is no Geist or spirit that lives in you. You are you. You are the individual egoist self for Stirner. No longer fearing for one's life because they have it already. To begin from life. To begin your individual egoist life from your life. Seeking is accepting one is not one yourself already. Where will I find myself is a stupid thing to say, basically. One's life is not owed to anything, and as such can simply be. A human being is called to nothing, and has no mission, no purpose, no more than a plant or a beast has a calling. So all things are nothing to me, is where I'll end up, where I'll finish. So I hope you've enjoyed these two talks on Stirner. Outside of the unique and its property, read both editions, both translations are good. Probably read Landstreicher first, then go back and see if you want to really dive into it. And then outside of that, you have Stirner's critics and a few other little bits. But really, just spend time with the unique and its property. I hope these have helped the book make sense to you. There's a lot of other egoist writing out there, but nothing really beats the unique and its property for egoism. So those are my two talks on the unique and its property by Max Stirner. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you.